So my friend has been super secretive about his writing for years, but just recently asked if I could look at some of his stuff and make edits. Now, as someone who knows the soul-crushing pain of having no one read their work, I said yeah, sure, I'll give it a read, so he sent it over. He gave me a ton of stuff, but my favorite story so far is about this guy named Steve Kerr and his journey as a pro basketball player. And oh boy, I just felt like I had to share this. My friend put so much work into this that I can't even begin to explain. I mean, he even sent me this whole portfolio of art and illustrations, like the one you're looking at now. But you'll honestly not believe me until you actually hear the story. And yes, I had permission to share this, so let's get into it. Oh, also, as things come up, I'm just going to comment and critique and share my edits because I really can't resist. Okay, so like I said, the story's main character is named Steve Kerr. Steve is a pretty generic name for a protagonist to have, but I can roll with it. That generality can make a character more approachable. Kerr was an interesting choice of a last name though, because it's like the Old English word cur, like something bad or evil, but it's spelled K-E-R-R. Using character names as foreshadowing is a little ham-fisted, but I like the use of the literary technique for a beginner, so why not? So the story begins with Steve in Lebanon, where he was born. And before you ask, no, he isn't Lebanese, he's white. The first chapter my friend sent over is all about Steve's family and their history, basically the backstory to the events that will come later. My friend made it so that Steve's grandfather volunteered with the Near East Relief after the Armenian genocide and rescued women and orphans in Aleppo. Also, Steve's dad was the president of the American University in Beirut. Steve went to school at Cairo American College, but my friend also notes at the bottom of the page that it's actually a K-12 school that's just called a college. Seems a little unnecessarily confusing to me, but whatever. While Steve was there, he got really into basketball and was eventually recruited to play at the University of Arizona for the Wildcats. I actually really like this part of the story because Steve isn't supposed to be some god of basketball playing at the best school of all time. He's just a good player that made it to a good school. It's believable, and it starts the story grounded in realism. And I say all that because the next chapter he sent me is the most ridiculous thing I have read in a while. So you know how I said Steve's family lived in the Middle East? Okay, so while Steve was playing in Arizona, and I kid you not, it's right here on the draft in front of me, his dad was hunted down and killed by jihadists that would later become Hezbollah. They apparently came into the university Steve's dad worked in with suppressed handguns and shot Steve's dad in the back of the head twice. I'm pretty sure this is supposed to be the inciting incident for the story because Steve's character completely changes when he gets this news. When Steve is about to play the arch-rival Arizona State, the crowd chants PLO, which is the acronym for the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is a real-life group that fights for the armed liberation of Palestine. Yeah, my friend really did his homework. After breaking down crying, which I found a tad melodramatic, Steve answered back by scoring 20 points in the first half of the game, making all 6 of his three-pointers and leading his team to victory. Okay, so one of the notes that I left for my friend was that while I liked the introduction of struggle, all this just seems way out of left field for a story about a basketball player. It just doesn't feel realistic, like something I can believe. I wrote that maybe instead of having Steve's dad be murdered by terrorists, the inciting incident could be like a personal struggle with Steve. Like maybe he doesn't think he is good enough to play on a collegiate level, or he maybe is nervous to play against the rivals. This whole Middle East jihadist thing is just way over the top. If I were my friend, I would focus the story and struggle way more on basketball, which is the center of Steve's character. And thankfully, he pretty much gets back to that. Now, I don't know how many of you like basketball, but it's my favorite sport. And I like to dribble up and down the court and all that good stuff, yes. My friend is super into it too, which I feel like helped him in creating a main character with interesting abilities, because that is a really important step in storytelling. It's not a necessity, but you want your protagonist to feel special, to have something that sets them apart from the other characters. That is why they're the protagonist. The focus should be on them for a reason. For Steve, that was shooting. Steve wasn't super fast or strong, my friend didn't make him jump very high or dribble super well. He was a pretty average dude, except for shooting. Steve could shoot the piss out of a basketball. That was his spidey sense, his going ghost, his death note, his special thing. Steve left college setting the all-time record for three-point shooting percentage in a season with 57%. For those of you who don't know basketball, the average is like 33%. So he was darn near twice as good as the average shooter. The drafts I have dictate this being Steve's defining character trait. I'm pretty sure what my friend was going for is like a Batman type thing where you take your protagonist's greatest fear or weakness and turn it into a strength. Steve's dad was shot to death, so Steve took that and made shooting his greatest strength on the court. It might not play well with certain audiences, but I kinda like it. So of course Steve's story isn't going to end in college though. He got drafted into the NBA because he has the basketball equivalent of plot armor, and you can't just have your main character who plays basketball not be in the NBA. And from this point on, I basically told my friend that Steve Kerr turns into basketball Forrest Gump. And I mean, what happens in the second act of the story is fun and cool, but it needs some pretty major edits, and you'll probably see why. So Steve was drafted to the Phoenix Suns, and after a few years of being on a mediocre team and nothing really happening, basically like a plot bus stop, Steve gets traded to the Orlando Magic and plays with rookie Shaquille O'Neal. Yeah, like Big Diesel himself. This is a really cool plot device to use in fiction because pairing a famous real-world character with your protagonist can help accentuate the protagonist's own mythos with the audience. Very much like how Ezio gets to work with Da Vinci in Assassin's Creed 2. My only critique for this would be to make the pairing meaningful for the story, which my friend neglected in the draft he gave me. Steve only played with Shaq for a year, and nothing of note really happened before Steve moved on to a new team. And that new team was the Chicago Bulls, who had, you guessed it, Michael frickin' Jordan and Scottie Madonna's Bane Pippen, two of the greatest players to ever put on a jersey. My friend detailed in notes that this was the part of the narrative where he wanted the audience to go on a power trip with Steve, like when Superman could just let loose against Darkseid. But my friend certainly wanted to show that Steve's team was great, not just tell the audience about it. But he did go a bit too far in trying to impress the Bulls' greatness on the audience, to the point where it just becomes plain like cliche and unbelievable. For example, Steve and the Bulls would have the greatest regular season in NBA history, winning 72 out of 82 games, an NBA record, and winning the championship at the end too. The next year, Steve wins the NBA three-point contest, crowning him as the best shooter in the league, and his team made it back to the finals again. Except this time, it wasn't Michael Jordan who won it for the team, it was Steve. Instead of taking the shot himself, Michael Jordan passed the ball to Steve with the clock winding down. And boom, right at the end of the chapter, Steve makes the shot. A note I left him is that while I think it's a cool notion that Michael Jordan would defer to Steve, signifying Steve coming to the climax of his character arc by becoming recognized and respected by the greatest player on the planet, this is just plain unbelievable. Michael Jordan would never let someone else take the last shot in a game that was so important. Always remember that when bringing in characters or real people into your writing, take special care to model their actions correctly. Your own characters are easy to control because you made them. Already established characters and real-life figures become more tricky because they are predefined. So Steve and the Bulls won another championship after that, making it 3 in a row. I think at this point, my friend realized the story was becoming a bit stale, so he wrote that Steve would be traded to another team. My friend didn't want to completely rob Steve of the chance to compete either, so he placed him on the San Antonio Spurs. Steve got to play with David Robinson and Tim Duncan, two more of the greatest players of all time. And yeah, you guessed it, Steve and the Spurs won the championship the very first year he got there. Steve would finish his career with the Spurs, even though he had this weird redemption arc playing for Portland for a little bit, but that will probably be redacted. When he eventually did come back to San Antonio, he got to play with young Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker. Again, NBA legends. And what does Steve win when he comes back? Another NBA championship. So when all is said and done, Steve would retire with 5 NBA championships and as the all-time leader in three-point percentage for both single season and a career. And for those of you who don't speak basketball, that means he was the most accurate three-point shooter ever. Like, ever in the history of basketball. Maybe now you can see why I called Steve Basketball Forrest Gump. He got to bounce around the NBA playing with all these legends on all these winning teams. A note that I left my friend is that having Steve win so many championships is just kind of predictable. I mean, he wins 4 in a row at one point for Pete's sake. That pretty much doesn't happen in real life. In fact, it hasn't happened since before the Vietnam War. One of the great rules of writing is to keep your protagonist relatable. Maybe not by experience, but by struggle. Everyone goes through struggle, and so everyone understands struggle. Steve needed to struggle during the story, not just win. To close his story, my friend chose to make the last section of the narrative kind of like a cross between a third act and an epilogue. Kind of like how at the end of Red Dead 1, you get to play as Jack Marston after John dies. The main story is pretty much over, but there is still some relevant information. So after Steve retired from the NBA, my friend wrote that Steve loved the game so much that he went on to do commentating for both TNT and the NBA 2K series. Yeah, you might have heard of them. Steve did this for a few years, but realized that just talking about basketball couldn't scratch that itch that he had. His fix? Steve actually became the general manager for the Phoenix Suns, the team that first drafted him. And you know who eventually had a reunion with him? His old buddy Shaq, who Steve got to come to the Suns through a trade, pretty much becoming his mega boss. But not even this was enough for Steve. He wanted to be closer to the action. as close as he possibly could be. After a few years, Steve stepped down as the GM for the Suns and became the head coach for the Golden State Warriors. In his first year, like his very first year, Steve coached the Warriors to the best record in the league and beat LeBron James in the finals. The very next year, his second mind you, Steve won Coach of the Year by coaching his team to the best record again. But not just any record, Steve's Warriors won 73 games, breaking the record that Steve himself helped set when he played in Chicago with Michael Jordan. So just think about that for a little bit. My friend wrote that Steve beat the all-time win record as a player and then beat it again as a coach. But you want to know the best part about all this? My friend created a character on the Warriors roster that not only was the first unanimous MVP ever in NBA history, but was also the best shooter in the league. His name? Stephon Curry. Stephon Curry, Steve Kerr. See what he's trying to do here? It's really lazy, I know. I honestly think this last section is a simple case of poor planning and writer fatigue. When you don't have a solid idea for where a story is supposed to go, coming to a good conclusion can become very difficult. Some writers are excellent at just winging a story. George R. R. Martin says this is his preferred method. Others require super detailed outlines to bring their plot to a close. One pitfall of having a free-forming plot, especially for novice writers, is that you can become fatigued at the end. You have to put so much time and effort and thought into the work that you just become exhausted. Without a plan or outline to follow, you might become okay with just putting anything on the page to be done. Luckily, this isn't anything that can't be fixed with editing. So, okay, this is where I'm going to stop for now. There's actually a lot more stuff for the story with Steve, like him getting really good players to add to his team like every single year, and this weird back problem that comes up for him now and again, but I think you get the gist from what I've shared today. I hope getting my edits and critiques to my friend's stupid story helped you think about your own writing. My friend actually has a bunch more on other characters that he has made up, so if you want to hear those and my critiques, just let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.